Welcome back. There are continued mixed reactions to the publishing of the new Basic Education Laws Amendment Act regulations. The two regulations that were published address the issues of school admissions, language policy and capacity. Now, the Good Party is criticising the changes, accusing the minister of undermining the act with what it says are restrictive regulations. Now, to elaborate on what the party means, I am now joined by its Secretary General, Brett Herron. A very good evening to you, Brett. Thank you so much for joining us. Just if you could please just succinctly elaborate on some of the grievances that you have so far with this amendment.
Good evening, Masa. The regulations or the draft regulations that the Minister of Education has published attempt to amend the legislation that was adopted by Parliament with regards to admission policies of public schools. The BELA Act, which amended the South African Schools Act, required that school governing bodies and heads of department and provincial education departments take into account the needs of the broader community in an education district. The Minister has published these draft regulations in which she says the policy should take into account the interests of the community in the surrounding community of the public school, including their language preferences. And this draft regulation very closely follows the language of the bilateral agreement that she concluded directly with Solidarity and AfriForum in November 2024, where she agreed that the admissions policy should take into account the interests of the community in the immediate vicinity of the public school. So she has narrowed the application of the Act to take into account only those interests or needs of the community immediately surrounding a public school.
Was that not what the BELA Act was trying to do the opposite of?
Precisely. The BELA Act was trying to do away with exclusionary policies that were being adopted by public school governing bodies in order to make use of capacity that was available in public schools in well-resourced areas mostly, and where language and admission policies were being used to exclude children, mostly I would say children of color, from attending public schools in formerly white areas.
You know, you also mentioned November and also a bilateral agreement too, because we can remember there was that protest by AfriForum, Solidarity and the Democratic Alliance against these aspects, certain aspects of BELA. What was the resolve to that? Because from my understanding was that it remains as is. And if that is the case, how then was the minister able to then include that in the draft regulations when it wasn't a part of the initial plan?
Well, the minister, lawfully, I don't think the minister can amend the legislation by way of regulations. In fact, it's settled law in South Africa in terms of court judgments that the minister's subordinate legislation, which is the regulations, is there to really implement the legislation. But you're quite right. In October 2024, Solidarity lodged a dispute with the Minister of Basic Education before NEDLAC, citing a socio-economic interest that would be affected by their constituency. And the NEDLAC process started in October. Before it was concluded, there was this large protest where 10,000 people apparently protested at the Voortrekker Monument, led by the Democratic Alliance, Solidarity, AfriForum, and Freedom Front Plus. But parallel to that process, the Minister of Basic Education, who was also a member of the Democratic Alliance, was engaged in private or bilateral discussions with Solidarity, and they ultimately concluded a settlement agreement. But the president ignored that settlement agreement, as he should have done, given that it was really an agreement between two parties, excluding all the other social partners that had an interest in education.
So as it stands with these draft regulations and your concerns about them too, as the Good Party, what are you going to do about this? Are you going to approach Parliament?
So the draft regulations are out for public comment until the 5th of September. and we've submitted our objection to the regulations. And if the minister proceeds to gazette those as the final regulations, we will have to seek legal advice about challenging the legality of them because, as I said earlier, the minister cannot use regulations, her public power to draft and publish regulations, to implement a private agreement that she concluded with Solidarity, excluding everybody else in the country who has an interest in education.
And speaking about excluding, Brett, earlier on in this interview as well, you're mentioning just the historical exclusion, of course, of children of color, black, colored, and Indian children in some of those schools too. And I want to pick up on something that you've mentioned as the good party, where you say the school language policies remain among the most contested and politically weaponized tools used to preserve historical privilege under the guise of cultural protection. Could you expand on that as well, and this political weaponization when it comes to the language policies that you have picked up?
Well, I mean, the protest that took place at the Voortrekker Monument and the debate around the BELA Act before it was finally implemented by the president was that the BELA Act was intended to destroy the Afrikaans language. And there's no evidence of that. I mean, the mother tongue language is protected by our laws and by our constitution. But parties who were sort of opposed to transformation and change in our society picked up on this BELA Act and engaged in a disinformation campaign about what the act is about. And the act is essentially about using spare capacity at public schools in order for children to access education, which is their right. And there were schools that have capacity that have been before the High Courts and even the Constitutional Court, where these courts have found that the capacity must be used and admission policies and language policies cannot be used to exclude children. But these organizations, including political parties like the DA and the Freedom Front Plus, have weaponized this act and have claimed in a massive misinformation or disinformation campaign that it is intended to destroy Afrikaans.
And as the good party, you are urging citizens to take part in this public process of participation.
Absolutely. I think it's important that that all South Africans pay attention to this act, pay attention to how a minister could be abusing her powers to implement an agreement that she reached with one trade union, Solidarity, in a sector that is so important to the future of our country, and in a sector where there are multiple social partners who have an interest. And she's implementing a private agreement that is aligned to her political party's weaponization of language. And South Africans need to respond to these draft regulations. And if the minister doesn't amend them, we will have to challenge the legality of them.
Brett, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate your time.